forget, for just a moment, the way we know winter today. For most of us, winter means central heating that clicks on before we wake, a padded jacket that keeps out the wind, and maybe a mug of hot chocolate steaming gently in our hands. We think of snow as something to photograph, to post, or to admire for its beauty. But in the centuries of the Little Ice Age, winter was not something you admired. It was something you survived, or you didn't. The cold was not a gentle backdrop. It was an enemy. The rivers froze so solid that people could walk across them, but the same ice cut off trade and food supplies. Crops failed again and again, leaving barns and granaries bare long before the snow had even finished falling. The bitter air sank into stone cottages, and it stayed there day and night, gnawing at the bones of the poor and the wealthy alike. In the modern world, we often imagine history as something distant, glamorous, or even romantic. But the truth is that most of the past was profoundly uncomfortable. And in those winters, in the age before insulation, before reliable food storage, before the science of heating, life shrank down to the most basic instinct: keep warm and stay alive until spring. If you enjoy sinking into these quiet journeys through the stranger and darker sides of history, then feel free to like this video and subscribe. It helps the channel reach more curious minds who, like you, want to drift to sleep while learning something new. And tell me in the comments below, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now for you? I always love to imagine the far-flung places where these words might be heard. So now, close your eyes, dim the lights, and let us walk together into the endless frost and see what it truly meant to face the worst winters of the Little Ice Age. It often began quietly, not with a sudden blizzard, not with a roaring storm, but with a change in the air that everyone could feel. The wind grew sharper, the daylight shorter. A farmer could stand in his fields at dusk and know, with a sinking weight in his chest, that the growing season had ended too soon. The earth hardened underfoot weeks earlier than expected. The ground that once gave way softly beneath a plow began to resist, like stone. Wheat, barley, and rye stalks turned brittle, their heads half-formed as if frozen in the act of ripening. In the villages, the gossip in the market stalls turned anxious. People asked one another if they had managed to store enough food, if the harvest wagons had been full, or only half laden this year. Rivers were the first to give their warnings. Thin sheets of ice crept across their surface earlier and earlier, sometimes as soon as late autumn. Children would test them with sticks, laughing at the cracking sounds, but the adults watched in silence. Because when the rivers froze, the mills that ground grain into flour also stopped. And when the mills stopped, bread grew scarcer with each passing week. Inside the cottages, smoke clung to the rafters. Fires were already burning longer hours, wood piles shrinking too quickly. People began to notice their breath inside the house, each word puffing out in a little cloud. Curtains, if there were any, grew stiff with frost at night. In wealthier homes, servants hurried to stuff straw into gaps around doors and windows. In poorer huts, there was nothing to do but wrap yourself in old cloth and pray that the frostbite would spare your fingers. And everywhere there was talk. Talk of omens, of bad signs in the skies, of God's displeasure, of witches whispering storms into existence. In a time before weather forecasts or science, the only explanation for an early, punishing cold was supernatural. People went to bed uneasy, wondering not just about the weather, but about fate itself. This was how the great winters of the Little Ice Age began. Not as sudden catastrophes, but as creeping shadows, an extra chill in the air, a barn not quite full enough, a sky that darkened too early. Signs that might have seemed small in the moment, but which carried the weight of life or death for the months to come. When the cold truly settled in, it did not simply shape the weather. It reached into every detail of daily life, bending and twisting the routines that people depended on. The first change was in the mornings. In warmer seasons, The village stirred with the sound of roosters and the shuffle of feet heading into fields. But in the dead of the little Ice Age winters, mornings were quieter. People lingered under layers of wool, linen, or, more often, whatever scraps of cloth they had managed to keep from moths. Rising meant exposing yourself to air so sharp it felt like a slap. Breathing in was painful, as if the lungs themselves might freeze. Houses, simple cottages of stone or wood, were no protection. Their walls leaked cold. Roofs cracked and sagged beneath the weight of snow. The lucky had hearths big enough to hold a steady fire, but most hearths were small and wood scarce. Families learned to sleep huddled together on straw pallets, pressing against one another for warmth. A child might wake in the night not from nightmares, but because their sibling had shifted, and the fragile layer of shared heat slipped away. Meals grew simpler. Bread was the cornerstone, yet even bread became a luxury when grain stocks dwindled. Soups stretched with water, cabbage or dried peas became the norm. In many households the same thin stew simmered for days, bones and scraps added in when available, until the pot itself seemed to carry the taste of desperation. People gnawed on turnips as if they were apples, and drank weak ale because water often froze solid in its buckets. Daily work no longer followed the rhythm of planting and harvesting. Instead, it became the rhythm of survival. Men trudged into forests to gather fallen branches, their hands wrapped in rags because gloves were too costly. Women spent hours mending old garments, sewing patches onto patches until clothes resembled quilts of fraying fabric. Children were given tasks too, chasing away the ever-hungry rats, fetching snow to melt for cooking, or watching the family's small fire so it did not burn out. The marketplace, once lively with chatter, dulled to a hum of complaints and bargaining. Goods were scarce, and what was available was often of poor quality. Fish froze on the stalls before buyers could take them home. Chickens stopped laying eggs in the bitter cold, and when a bird did produce one, it was treated as a minor miracle. Even candles, essential for light during the long nights, grew more expensive, and many families sat in darkness, conserving what they could. Travel, too, was transformed. Roads hardened like iron, ruts from wagon wheels turning into jagged traps beneath the snow. Horses stumbled and grew thin, their feed reduced along with their masters. A journey that might take a day in summer could drag into 3 or 4 in winter or be abandoned altogether. Entire villages became isolated, cut off from their neighbors, left to rely only on what they already had. And underlying all these changes was fear. Fear of the cold itself, which killed silently in the night. Fear of hunger, which lingered in the pit of every stomach. Fear of thieves, because when survival was at stake, even the neighbor you had known for years might be tempted to steal your woodpile or your last loaf of bread. Winter in the Little Ice Age was not just a season. It was a force that remade the shape of everyday existence. What once felt normal, waking, eating, working, speaking with neighbors, was turned into a series of struggles. Struggles that never seemed to end, because even when you endured one day, you knew another long, bitter day was waiting just beyond it. If the cold and hunger could be felt in the body, fear lived deeper in the mind. In the villages and towns of the Little Ice Age, people did not just experience the chill of the season. They carried the weight of knowing that winter could last longer than anyone expected, and that if it did, their supplies, their health, even their hope itself, might not endure. Every year, as autumn slipped into frost, a familiar anxiety returned. Farmers and townsfolk counted their stores with a nervous precision. Barrels of salted fish were lifted and weighed. Sacks of grain were checked for rot or mold. Root vegetables were laid out on floors to see which had already begun to shrivel. And always there was the same question: would it last? Superstitions flourished in this atmosphere of dread. A red sunrise in November might be read as a sign of storms to come. The sudden silence of birds or the restless movements of dogs could be taken as omens of a harsh and endless winter. Old women told stories of winters so long that rivers did not thaw until midsummer, and of villages where no baby survived to spring. Children listened, wide-eyed, absorbing the lesson. Nature was not to be trusted. Religion, too, became a shield against fear. In Catholic Europe, priests held processions to beg God for mercy, candles held high against the dark sky. In Protestant towns, sermons thundered that the cold was punishment for sin. Communities gathered in churches, their breath visible even inside the stone walls, reciting prayers through chattering teeth. Some believed the devil himself walked with the snow, luring the weak to despair. Witchcraft was another explanation. In times of hunger, people sought someone to blame. A cow that stopped giving milk, a well that froze deeper than others, or a neighbor whose fire never seemed to die down, any of these could ignite suspicion. Women, especially the poor or the odd, were accused of summoning storms or cursing the harvest. Trials and burnings often spiked in the depths of winter, when fear and desperation ran highest. The nights were the hardest. They stretched endlessly with darkness swallowing the hours. Families lay awake, listening to the creak of beams under snow, the moan of wind through the shutters. Every sound could spark unease. Was that the howl of a wolf, hungry enough to approach the edge of the village? Was that the groan of ice shifting on the river, threatening to break the bridge? Or was it just the house itself, groaning under the weight of the season? Stories circulated of travelers caught in snowstorms, their bodies found months later, curled against hedges or half buried in drifts. These tales were told and retold by firelight, not only as warnings but as grim entertainment. People needed stories to make sense of their dread, to give shape to the terror of the cold. Children grew up with these fears etched into them. They learned from their first winters that survival was never guaranteed. Their games reflected it, building little fires of sticks, pretending to beg for bread, pretending to pray for spring. Fear was not something hidden from them. It was passed on like a family heirloom. And yet, despite the prayers, the suspicions, the stories, the one certainty was that winter did what it wanted. People could prepare, they could fast, they could beg for mercy, but they could not control the season. And that helplessness, perhaps more than hunger or frost, was the heaviest burden. The fear of the long winter was not irrational. It was memory, lived and repeated generation after generation. Each year, the cold reminded people that survival was fragile and that life could narrow in a single season to the thin line between endurance and despair. By midwinter, the question was no longer whether the cold could be endured. It was whether the food would last. Every autumn, families measured their harvest and stored what they could. Barrels of salted fish, sacks of rye, wheels of hard cheese, and bundles of onions were carefully stacked in cellars and lofts. Yet, no matter how carefully counted, the supplies always seemed to shrink too quickly. Rats and mice claimed their share first. They gnawed through sacks and nibbled at crumbs until entire stores were spoiled. Cats were prized for keeping vermin away, but even the hungriest cats could not keep up with the armies of rodents that thrived in winter as dark corners. In some villages, it was said that the rats were as great an enemy as the frost itself. Spoilage was another enemy. Without modern preservation, much food simply rotted. Grains grew damp and sprouted. Meat cured with too little salt turned sour. Cabbages and turnips, stacked in mounds, shriveled into leathery husks. The smell of decay lingered in many homes, a constant reminder that the future was already spoiling before it arrived. Bread, the most basic staple, became rarer each week. Bakers mixed their flour with cheaper fillers, ground acorns, dried beans, or even powdered bark. The loaves grew smaller, darker, and harder. What once fed a family for a day might barely stretch to a single meal. In cities, the price of bread rose so high that riots broke out, hungry crowds demanding relief from officials who had little to give. Families tried to ration, but rationing brought its own misery. Children cried in the night with empty bellies. Parents pretended to have already eaten, pushing their portion to the youngest. There are records of fathers chewing on leather straps to quiet their hunger, and mothers boiling weeds to fool their children into thinking they had prepared a meal. Hunger, once rare, became an everyday companion, gnawing not just at the stomach, but at the mind. Some households turned to desperate measures. Dogs and cats were slaughtered. Horses, when they grew too weak to pull loads, were eaten instead. In certain chronicles, there are whispers of cannibalism during the harshest years, stories of travelers who vanished, or of stews whose meat was never quite explained. Whether these stories were true or not, the fact that people believed them showed how deep the fear of starvation ran. In the countryside, gleaning became a matter of survival. Women and children scoured the frozen fields for anything left behind after the harvest: kernels of grain overlooked, a beet half buried in soil, a carrot shriveled but still edible. In towns, scavengers roamed markets after dark, scraping what they could from the refuse: wilted leaves, broken eggs, bones with scraps of meat still clinging to them. The hunger did not just weaken the body, it changed behavior. Neighbors who once shared freely grew suspicious of one another. A missing chicken might lead to an accusation of theft. A hidden sack of grain could provoke envy, anger, even violence. Communities strained under the weight of scarcity, and trust was often the first casualty. And yet, through it all, people hoped each year that the spring would arrive before the last sack was emptied. They prayed that their meager stores would last just a little longer, that the rats would not find the last barrel, that the bread would stretch one more week. Hunger reduced life to counting the loaves, counting the days, counting the chances of survival. The cruelest truth of the Little Ice Age winters was that hunger was not sudden. It crept in slowly, tightening its grip week after week, until the belly ached constantly and the mind grew foggy from want. And once it took hold, there was no escape but endurance, or despair. When the granaries emptied and the cellars grew bare, people did not simply surrender to hunger. They improvised, they experimented, and often they ate things that we, in the modern world, would scarcely recognize as food. Bread, once soft and nourishing, became the first victim of desperation. Bakers could no longer rely on pure flour. Instead, they stretched it with whatever filler they could find. Sawdust was sifted into dough, giving loaves a bitter, woody taste. Ground acorns, too, were common, though they had to be soaked and boiled repeatedly to leach out their poisons. Sometimes even clay was mixed in, not to nourish, but to trick the stomach into feeling full. The bread was heavy, gray, and difficult to chew, yet people were grateful simply to have something to put between their teeth. Soups became a second field of experimentation. A pot of water simmering over the fire could become the heart of a family's diet for weeks. Into it went cabbage leaves, potato skins, bits of onion, or anything remotely edible. If bones were available, they were boiled again and again, until they dissolved into a pale broth. In some households, the same pot was kept simmering for months, each day receiving scraps of food, and each day ladled out in smaller portions. People joked grimly that the pot never grew cleaner, only older, seasoned with despair. Roots and weeds played their part. Dandelion leaves, nettles, and grasses were boiled into bitter stews. Bark was stripped from trees, dried, and ground into powder. Families in Scandinavia were known to bake bark bread, dense black loaves that were said to splinter the teeth. In the Alps, peasants ate soups thickened with straw cut into fine shreds, hoping that it would at least slow the pangs of hunger. Meat, if it could be found, was rarely fresh. In the depths of winter, animals grew too thin to slaughter, and those that were killed were often preserved poorly. Families ate rancid bacon, smoked fish crawling with worms, or sausages whose casings had burst in the cold. Hunger dulled disgust. The choice was simple: eat what was available, or eat nothing at all. Even leather found its way into cooking pots. Old shoes, belts, and harnesses were boiled for hours until they softened into a gummy stew. The broth smelled foul, but it carried a trace of calories, and in the silence of famine, even that was enough. Chronicles from Russia and France speak of families who survived weeks on little more than boiled leather and melted snow. Children often suffered the most. Mothers tried to create illusions of nourishment, sweetening water with burnt sugar or handing a crust of bark bread as if it were a treat. In many homes, children were told stories of feasts and plenty while chewing on scraps, the imagination used as a shield against despair. Markets, too, reflected this desperate creativity. Vendors sold things that would have been unthinkable in good years: roasted rats, blackened cats, sparrows strung together on sticks. In German towns, dogs were called roof rabbits and eaten openly. In Paris, during one particularly grim winter, the city's zoo animals disappeared one by one, sold to butchers who claimed they were offering exotic delicacies. And yet, even amid this desperation, there were glimmers of resilience. People passed down recipes for famine foods as carefully as recipes for feasts. They shared tips on how to soak acorns, how to boil nettles without burning your tongue, how to roast weeds so they tasted almost like herbs. These strange meals became symbols of survival, proof that even in the harshest winters, human beings would find ways to endure. To us, these dishes sound grotesque: bread of bark and sawdust, soups of weeds, stews of leather. But to those who lived through the Little Ice Age, they were more than meals. They were hope, boiled down into bowls and loaves, swallowed with grim determination against the long night of hunger. If hunger gnawed at the stomach, cold pierced the very bones. The houses of the Little Ice Age were never designed for such relentless frost. Stone walls absorbed the chill and held it. Roofs, thatched or tiled, let icy air seep through every crack. Frost formed on the inside of window panes so thick you could scratch patterns into it, and the faint glow of candles made those patterns shimmer as if lit from within. Each morning, people woke to indoor temperatures that bit as fiercely as those outside. Water buckets, left near the hearth overnight, froze solid. Bread stored on shelves became so hard it might as well have been stone. Simple tasks, washing hands, preparing breakfast, drawing water, required breaking ice first. Children learned early to pull on frozen shoes with stiff fingers. Those with means piled their homes with straw to block drafts. They covered walls with tapestries or patched cracks with mud. Curtains were hung across doorways to keep in heat, though whatever warmth was caught soon slipped away. Chimneys smoked constantly, blackening ceilings and lungs alike. In grander homes, fires burned in multiple hearths, but most houses had a single hearth that served for cooking, heating, and light. Keeping that fire alive was essential. Embers were banked at night beneath a thick layer of ash, preserving a fragile glow that could be coaxed back into flame at dawn. Sleeping arrangements shifted. Families squeezed together on shared pallets. Children nestled between parents and grandparents, bodies pressed so close that breath warmed the blankets. The weight of layers, blankets, furs, patched quilts, bent the straw mattresses. But if anyone moved too far from the collective warmth, a cold finger of air would creep in and wake them with a shiver. Often, families brought animals into the house, not merely for protection from predators, but for their warmth. Chickens roosted in corners, pigs grunted softly under tables. Cows stood in adjoining rooms, their bodies radiating heat like living ovens. Waking in the night was common. The cold did not let people rest easily. The fire demanded tending, wood needed to be added, and embers stirred. Someone would rise, wrap a cloak around themselves, and shuffle to the hearth, teeth chattering. Sparks would fly and glow, and for a moment the room would fill with dancing shadows. Then the cloak would be wrapped more tightly, and the sleeper would hurry back under the covers, hoping to catch the warmth that had already begun to fade. The cold found its way into bodies, too. Chilblains, painful inflammations of the skin appeared on hands and feet. Ears and noses cracked and bled. Frostbite lurked like a predator, turning fingers and toes numb, then white, then black. People rubbed their hands with snow to restore circulation, or plunged them into icy water because they believed the shock might save their digits. Oftentimes, it did not. Missing fingers and toes were not uncommon by spring, and yet, through all this, life inside a frozen house continued. People told stories, whispered prayers, sang to their children. Women spun wool and mended clothing by firelight. Men carved wood or repaired tools. Laughter still rang out, though it was often brittle as ice. In these cramped, cold spaces, families forged bonds that might not have formed in more comfortable times. They learned the warmth of togetherness, even when the world outside seemed intent on freezing them solid. Long before the Little Ice Age, people had invented ways to keep warm and fed. But in those extreme winters, ingenuity became a matter of survival. Across Europe, folk shared and adapted strategies, some born of tradition, others of necessity, to push back against the cold's advance. One of the simplest tricks was the hot stone. Stones were heated in the embers of a fire until they glowed faintly, then wrapped in cloth and carried to bed. Slipped under blankets, they radiated heat for hours. In some homes, stones were placed at the foot of the bed to keep toes from numbing. Others set them under chairs, warming seats before sitting down. When the stones cooled, they were returned to the hearth to be heated again, a quiet cycle that continued day after day. Walls, too, could help if treated properly. People plastered them with layers of clay mixed with straw, creating a crude but effective insulation. In regions where reeds were plentiful, mats woven from cattails or heather were hung on interior walls. In the Alps, some families built smaller rooms within rooms, essentially wooden boxes lined with fur and straw, where family members could huddle together. The air inside warmed from body heat and from the constant exhalation of breath, turning these makeshift shelters into pockets of bearable warmth within otherwise freezing houses. Clothing became a defense and a marker of ingenuity. Wool, if one could afford it, was prized for its insulating power. Those who could not afford wool layered linen upon linen, sometimes stuffing dried moss between layers. Sheep-ass wool was sometimes spun into thick yarn and knit into mittens so bulky that hands could hardly bend but at least stayed warm. Hats were essential. People tied scarves around their heads, layered hoods over caps, and even wrapped cloth around their faces until only their eyes showed. Feeding the fire was a constant struggle. Wood had to be collected and dried, a task difficult in snow and ice. In wooded regions, families gathered fallen branches and cut dead trees during the brief, warmer periods of midday. In treeless areas, people resorted to burning peat, animal dung, or dried weeds. In some coastal villages, driftwood became a gift from the sea. Children were sent out to collect anything that might burn, a practice so widespread that the fields and roadsides were picked clean, leaving bare landscapes in the spring. Animals beyond their warmth offered other tricks. In Norway and Sweden, people would bring goats into bed with them. The heat from the goat's body could keep a person alive through the coldest nights. In England, cats were cradled inside cloaks, their purring a comfort as well as a heater. Dogs were often welcomed at the foot of the bed, a position of honor for creatures that could warn off thieves and warm cold feet. Herbs and simple medicines were used to ward off winter ailments. Mustard poultices were applied to chests to ease coughing. Onion and garlic were eaten raw, believed to ward off illness. Elderberry and nettle teas were brewed to strengthen the blood, and honey, when available, sweetened these bitter concoctions. Folk remedies also included wearing certain stones thought to hold warmth, or hanging dried herbs in doorways to keep out cold spirits. These popular tricks were a patchwork of knowledge passed down through generations, shared between neighbors, and adapted to each new circumstance. They could not stop the winter, but they could carve out small refuges of warmth and hope. In the end, it was often these small things, the warmed stone, the layered shirt, the goat at one AS side. That made the difference between surviving until spring and succumbing to the cold. Water and fire are twin necessities. In the worst winters, both became scarce commodities, each dependent on the other. Keeping water liquid and fire burning required a careful dance, and failure meant disaster. Wells froze. Drawn water would freeze in buckets before it reached the hearth, forming thick rims of ice that had to be broken before cooking or washing. People resorted to melting snow for water, but snowpacks were often laced with dirt and animal droppings. Melting it produced a gray slush that settled into murky water. Families strained this water through cloth or let it sit until sediment fell to the bottom, then poured off what clarity they could. In some areas, especially near the coasts, people broke holes in river ice or collected seawater at tide pools, boiling it down to get salt and water at the same time. The effort of obtaining water was matched by the effort of keeping fire. Without fire, water could not melt, bread could not bake, illness could not be pushed back. Firewood, even when gathered, did not always cooperate. Green wood was damp and smoky. It hissed and spit when placed on coals. Thick logs required time to catch and gave off less heat than hoped. Wood stored outside was sometimes encased in ice. People learned to place logs near the hearth for days before burning, so they dried out and lit more easily. To stretch their fuel, families built their fires slowly. In the mornings, the ash was cleared just enough to uncover embers. Small twigs and dried leaves were coaxed to flame, then larger pieces of wood added sparingly. Fires were not allowed to blaze. They smoldered, providing enough heat to cook porridge or soup while lasting hours longer than a roaring fire would have. Some communities had shared ovens or communal hearths where families took turns baking bread and warming meals, conserving wood by cooking together. Accidents were deadly. A pot tipped over, and boiling water scalded bare feet. Sparks leaped from the hearth, landing on straw or clothing. Entire houses were lost to fire, sometimes taking the rest of a village with them when flames jumped from thatched roof to thatched roof. Frozen water could not douse such fires quickly, and neighbors would beat at flames with wet cloths, their hands blistering from heat and frost alike. The line between freezing and burning was thin, and people walked it every day. Using stoves and braziers brought dangers of their own. Inefficient fireplaces filled rooms with smoke, damaging lungs and eyes. Carbon monoxide, though unnamed, claimed victims who slept too close to smoldering embers in unventilated spaces. Many a family woke in the morning lightheaded and nauseous, without understanding why. Yet they continued the practice, for the alternative was to freeze outright. Through winter after winter, the struggle to manage water and fire taught communities resilience and caution. Techniques improved. Hearts and hearths warmed those who endured. And when the thaw finally came and the ice turned once again to rushing streams, many felt an almost reverent gratitude for the simple act of drawing a bucket of water or feeling the heat of a flame without fear. Hunger and cold were killers, but they were aided by an array of winter diseases that swept through weakened bodies and crowded homes. In the Little Ice Age, the line between illness and weather was blurred. Frost cracked skin and made bodies susceptible to infection. Scarcity forced people into close quarters, turning houses into incubators of disease. Respiratory ailments were among the most common. The frigid air inflamed lungs, leading to chronic coughs that rattled rib cages and kept households awake with their hacking rhythm. Pneumonia was particularly feared. Without antibiotics, a simple cold could spiral quickly into a lung infection. Elders and infants were the first to succumb. Families wrapped the chests of the sick in warm cloths, applied mustard plasters to draw out congestion, and spooned them broths infused with garlic and thyme. Sometimes the patient recovered. Often they did not. Influenza, or the grippe, arrived in waves. Its fevers burned just as fiercely in winter as they did in summer. But the lack of food meant fevers consumed already low reserves of strength. Viral outbreaks killed thousands across Europe in the 1600s and 1700s. One winter's influenza could halve the population of a hamlet. After the fever, survivors often lingered with persistent weakness and coughs that never quite vanished. Frostbite, though not contagious, counted among these winter maladies. Toes turned black and dropped off. Fingers darkened and had to be cut away. Doctors amputated with saws heated by the fire to cauterize wounds, while the smell of burning flesh filled the room. Bandages were soaked in honey or wine, thought to ward off infection. Patients bit on leather straps to muffle their screams. Amputation saved some lives, others died of shock or gangrene. Typhus prowled in the seams of dirty clothes. It thrived where lice found warmth on unwashed skin. Crowded households wearing the same garments day in and day out provided ideal conditions. The fever came suddenly, accompanied by delirium. Victims muttered nonsense, saw visions, and sometimes tore at their own skin in an attempt to remove the insects they imagined crawling beneath it. In many towns, outbreaks of typhus coincided with famine and winter, the triad of miseries reinforcing one another. Doctors did what they knew. Bloodletting was common. Physicians believed that fever was caused by an excess of blood, so they opened veins and allowed pints to flow. Cupping and leeches followed. Patients were given mixtures of herbs, elderflower for fever, horehound for cough, wormwood for digestive troubles. The treatments sometimes helped, sometimes harmed. Faith in medicine often mingled with superstition, as prayers were whispered over steaming teas and saints' relics pressed to foreheads. Plagues lurked in memory, if not in actuality. The Black Death of the 14th century had burned itself into European consciousness, and any hint of swelling or buboes sent fears of plague coursing through communities. In some places, local outbreaks of bubonic plague did strike in the 17th century, more often in warmer months. Still, winter was a respite not from fear, but from those particular rats that carried fleas. People thanked the cold for that small mercy, even as it brought other killers to their doors. When disease took a life, grief followed familiar patterns. Bodies were wrapped in cloth, sometimes frozen so stiff they could not be placed in coffins easily. Cemeteries filled with shallow graves dug in hard ground. Priests said prayers in open air, breath pluming as they spoke. Those who remained took note of who did not survive, marking the toll of each winter with a tally of names whispered by the hearth. Beyond the physical toll, winter weighed heavily on the mind. Months of cold and hunger turned the inner landscapes of individuals into bleak territories. Despair seeped in like drafts through poorly sealed doors, making hearts as chilled as fingers. Depression, though unnamed, was felt keenly. People spoke of a heavy melancholy that settled on them with the snow. The endless darkness seemed to lengthen their thoughts into shadows. In many households, singing and dancing ceased, replaced by silence. Humor, which had once bubbled easily in summer, froze under the winter sky. Smiles were rarer and laughter more brittle. Chronic fatigue from malnutrition made every task seem insurmountable. Despair whispered that spring might never come. Faith offered solace, but it could also deepen anxiety. Was the cold divine punishment? Had the community angered God? Churches were fuller in winter, but prayers could turn frantic. Where miracles did not materialize, doubts grew. People fasted not by choice but by necessity, blurring the line between ritual abstinence and enforced starvation. In this confusion, some sought explanations in unseen forces. The devil, witches, ghosts, and malevolent spirits became scapegoats for the unrelenting chill. Relationships strained under the weight of these anxieties. Patience thinned. Arguments flared over minor provocations, a missing piece of firewood, a child crying for more food, a door left ajar. Domestic violence increased, as frustration and fear had nowhere else to go. In some cases, families dissolved. Husbands left in search of work or food and never returned. Wives walked out with children, seeking relatives who might share their scarce resources. Isolation intensified negative feelings. Many villages were cut off by snowdrifts for weeks. Roads were impassable, travelers scarce. News traveled slowly and rumors filled the void. The mind spun narratives that worsened fear. A late arrival at night might be imagined to be a marauding bandit or a hungry wolf. Dreams turned strange and vivid, filled with images of snow, hunger, and endless walking. People awoke startled, their hearts pounding, but they could not escape the cold even in sleep. Some communities found ways to nurture hope. Storytelling became medicine. Elders told tales of winters past and how they had been overcome. These stories, told in quiet voices by dim firelight, reminded listeners that cold did not last forever. Shared rituals helped too. In Scandinavia, the Feast of Lucia brought candles and song into the darkest days. In parts of Germany, people dressed as animals and paraded through streets, chasing away evil spirits with bells and drums. Such traditions injected moments of light into the gloom, if only for a night. The slow return of sunlight was felt first not on the skin, but in the mind. A day when the sun lingered just a little longer lifted spirits. People marked these small increments with joy. Children were sent outside to play again, their shrieks of laughter a balm to adults. Plans were made for the sowing of seeds, even if ground remained frozen. Hope broke through like early crocuses pushing up through snow. The psychological impact of the harsh winters left long scars. Journals, where they existed, speak of lingering fear each autumn, that the next winter would be the one to finish them. Songs and proverbs from the era are laced with cautionary tales about wastefulness and pride, urging humility before nature. In this way, the cold shaped not just bodies, but the very culture of the people who survived it. If the winters of the Little Ice Age were recorded anywhere most faithfully, it was in the stories people told. These were not stories of kings and battles, but of neighbors and small villages, of everyday heroes and tragedies that might otherwise have been forgotten. In the mountains of Switzerland, people told of Anna who, during the winter of 1695, ventured out in a storm to fetch water from a frozen creek. She never returned. Come spring, children found her figure, bent over a hole in the ice, still clutching the bucket. It was said that her ghost appeared on cold nights, a reminder that a single misstep could mean death. Mothers used Anna's story to warn their children not to wander far when snow fell. In a small French hamlet, a legend sprang up around a family who survived the worst winter by discovering a hidden spring beneath their barn. They drew water quietly, sharing it only with a few trusted neighbors. When others begged, they had to refuse for fear the spring would run dry. It was a story told with sorrow and shame, illustrating the painful choices scarcity demanded. Generations later, that spring was still called Le Puits des Larmes, the Well of Tears. On the windswept moors of northern England, an old man named Old Henry became a symbol of perseverance. One winter, his cottage caught fire when a stray ember escaped the hearth. With no water to douse it, Henry dragged wet clay from his chimney and smeared it over his roof and walls, smothering the flames. Villagers came to marvel at his clay-covered house, which stood out like a rough sculpture against the snow. Stories of Old Henry's quick thinking were told each winter, inspiring others to be resourceful when danger struck. Many tales centered on children. In Poland, a story circulated about siblings who discovered a cache of apples hidden under straw in an abandoned barn. They ate a few, then divided the rest among the hungriest families. Everyone thought the apples were gone, but through the winter, more seemed to appear each time the children visited the barn. Was it a miracle? Or did someone secretly replenish the barrel? People argued, but all agreed that the children's selflessness had brought them luck. Other stories had darker endings. In a village in Austria, records tell of a man who, driven mad by hunger, attacked his neighbors one night with an axe. He was subdued and tied up in the snow until morning, his own family refusing to shelter him. He did not survive the night. His story was told and retold as a warning of how hunger could drive a person to madness and violence. There were tales of animals, too. Wolves, driven closer to settlements by hunger, took sheep, goats, and even a child from a doorstep. Bears, normally hibernating, wandered into barns. But there were also stories of animals saving lives. Dogs that led lost travelers back to paths. Horses that refused to cross thin ice and thereby prevented carts from plunging into freezing rivers. These local stories were threads woven into the fabric of communal memory. They were told in whisper and song, written in parish registers and scribbled in the margins of account books. They carried lessons about caution, sharing, ingenuity, and endurance. Most importantly, they reminded each new generation that others had faced the cold and survived. Through story, the fear of winter became something that could be held, examined, and, in a small way, controlled. After months of relentless cold, the first hint of thaw seemed almost unbelievable. At first, it was a sound, the drip of water from a roof, the crack and groan of ice breaking under a warming sun. Then came a smell, the earthy scent of soil freed from its frozen prison. Winter did not depart gracefully. It retreated in fits and starts, reluctantly releasing its grip. As the ice softened, rivers swelled. What had been frozen highways turned into dangerous torrents. Ice flows crashed downstream, sometimes taking with them bridges that villagers had relied on for trade and travel. Ferrymen, idle all winter, scrambled to repair boats and prepare for the rush of melting snow. Floods were common. Saturated ground could not absorb the sudden influx, and water spilled into fields and homes. In low-lying towns, people built barriers of earth and timber, hoping to hold back the muddy tide. With thaw came another problem: rot. Carcasses of animals that had frozen in the fields began to decay. Their thawing bodies attracted flies. Rats, starved over winter, bred quickly in the wet warmth. Piles of refuse that had lain hidden under snow began to smell. Gutters overflowed with filth, and streets turned to mud. Thick, clinging mud that sucked at boots and dragged carts to a halt. Diseases associated with filth, like dysentery and cholera, found fertile ground in this wet world. Yet the thaw also brought joy. Ice on wells melted, and fresh water flowed easily. Snowdrifts receded from doorways. People could leave their villages, visit neighbors, and see relatives for the first time in months. Children splashed in puddles, their laughter returning to streets that had been silent. The sun rose a little higher each day, its warmth felt on faces and hands. People stood outside simply to feel light on their skin. Animals emerged from barns. Cows, stiff from being cramped indoors, bucked and ran clumsily in pastures. Sheep pawed through melting snow to find the first tender shoots of grass. Chickens scratched eagerly at thawing earth, searching for worms. These small scenes of life returning were balm for winter-weary souls. Household chores shifted with the thaw. Roofs were inspected for leaks and damage from ice. Chimneys were swept, their fires no longer needed constantly. Clothing that had rarely been washed in winter was boiled and scrubbed, then hung outside to dry in the cold breeze. Tools that had been put away in the fall were brought out and repaired. The process of preparing fields began, clearing debris, mending fences, and, once the ground was soft enough, plowing. The thaw was messy, dangerous, and invigorating. It marked the beginning of the end of suffering, while also reminding people that nature's power did not fade with winter's close. Survival demanded constant vigilance, even as hope blossomed alongside the first flowers. The end of winter was not the end of hardship. Scarcity lingered long after the frost receded. Fields needed to be planted, but seed grain might have been eaten during the worst of the hunger. Animals required feed, but haystacks had been consumed. Tools were worn. People themselves were weak and thin, lacking the strength they had possessed before winter. Spring planting was a race against time. The growing season during the Little Ice Age was shorter. Late frosts could still descend unexpectedly, killing seedlings. Farmers rose before dawn and worked until dusk, pushing their bodies to exhaustion to get crops into the ground. Children and elders joined in, picking stones from fields and breaking clods of soil. Every hand mattered. Women sowed flax and vegetables in gardens, hoping to have something to eat before the grain was ready. Rationing continued. The stores of salted meat and dried beans had been depleted. People turned to foraging. Meadows yielded dandelion leaves and wild garlic. Forests offered mushrooms, berries, and wild greens once the snow melted fully. Nettles and sorrel were boiled into soups that were thin but nourishing. If fish swam up the swollen rivers, nets were cast with renewed hope. Communities near the sea relished the return of herring and cod. Trade routes reopened. Merchants who had been trapped by snow now arrived with goods. Markets filled with activity again, though prices remained high until new harvests could replenish stocks. Relatives from other villages visited with gifts of grain or lentils. Weddings and christenings, postponed through winter, were celebrated with food as plentiful as people could muster. The resumption of social rituals helped heal frayed relationships. In many places, officials organized public works to aid recovery. Dikes and flood barriers were repaired. Roads ruined by ice and mud were resurfaced. Communal seed stores, if they survived the winter, distributed grain to those who had none. In some towns, wealthier citizens funded soup kitchens or distributions of clothing. These acts of organized charity helped knit societies back together after months of desperation. Psychologically, the mind needed healing too. The days lengthened, and people returned to fields and workshops with a weary sort of optimism. Laughter, stifled for months, returned in bursts. Songs, some newly composed about the horrors and the heroes of the past winter, were sung as people worked. Children played games not about hunger, but about sowing and reaping, about jumping over streams rather than breaking ice. But the scars remained. Many had lost loved ones. Families had been reduced. Fingers and toes were missing. Fields lay fallow because there were too few hands to work them. Memory of hunger made people cautious. Food was hoarded in anticipation of the next winter. Even in the warmth of spring, people looked at the sky with trepidation, scanning for signs of another long cold to come. Recovery, then, was not a return to what was, but a move toward a new normal. Resilience was a daily act. It took form in the careful planting of seeds saved under a sleeping child's pillow, in the sharing of nettle soup with a neighbor who had nothing, and in the refusal to forget the lessons carved by ice and hunger. The little Ice Age winters ended, but they did not fade quietly. They lived on in memories and in the stories people told, stories that shaped how communities understood themselves and their world. Songs are one of the earliest sources of these memories. Lullabies whispered by mothers to soothe hungry children included verses about snow and frost, about patience and spring. Folk songs recorded the names of winters by year, the year of the long famine, or the winter of frozen bread. These songs were sung not just as history lessons, but as charms. Singing about the worst times was believed to keep them at bay. When voices joined together, there was a sense of collective resilience. Proverbs from across Europe reflect this period. In England, people said, "Make hay while the sun shines, but keep flour until December." In Germany, the cold teaches what the heat forgets. In Russia, winter doesn't ask how your harvest was. These sayings were reminders of vulnerability and preparedness. They advised thrift and foresight, and they were repeated across generations until they became part of the language itself. Stories shared by grandparents became cautionary tales for the young. "Don't waste breadcrumbs," a grandmother might say, "for there was a winter when we boiled bark." "Be kind to your neighbors," a grandfather might add, "for it was the widow down the lane who gave us her last onion that saved us." Such narratives instilled values of frugality, generosity, and respect for nature's power. Art and literature, where they flourished, captured the stark beauty and terror of the winters. Paintings of ice fairs on the Thames showed people dancing, skating, and selling goods on the frozen river, scenes that were as festive as they were reminders of extraordinary cold. Chronicles described winters with a mixture of awe and dread. Priests recorded sermons about repentance and survival, while merchants noted price changes and trade disruptions. In personal diaries, when literacy allowed, ordinary people wrote of days spent chopping ice from wells and nights counted by how many times the fire had to be stoked. Perhaps most importantly, the memory of these winters influenced behavior long after the Little Ice Age ended. Communities built larger granaries, saved more seed grain, and diversified crops. Methods of preserving food improved. Architecture changed, with thicker walls and smaller windows to retain heat. Governments began to track grain reserves and to implement policies intended to prevent the worst famine. The memories of cold prompted societies to innovate, to prepare, and to value cooperation. Even today, echoes of those winters can be felt in cultural traditions. The midwinter festivals of light, the rituals of storing and preserving food in summer, the respect for elders who carry old stories of hardship. When people speak of the worst winter in living memory, they measure against a past when snow fell until roofs collapsed and when hunger led to boiling leather. Each new winter is viewed through the lens of old ones, and the relief of spring carries a gratitude that has been centuries in the making. As our story closes, you might find yourself drifting not just into sleep, but into the vast expanse of time, where winters come and go, and where the whispers of those who survived long ago still curl like smoke above the coals of a dying fire. Through their endurance, we are reminded that even the harshest seasons eventually yield to spring, and that every dawn carries the promise of warmth and light.